Muy buenos días, esta es tercera llamada. Para comenzar la siguiente conferencia magistral del Tercer Congreso Internacional Anáhuac de Calidad Educativa, Educar para la Convivencia Pacífica, Emociones, Adaptabilidad y Metacognición. Es importante cuidar las normas de protocolo de nuestra universidad, así como los lineamientos de seguridad sanitaria para los aquí presentes. Le recordamos que una política adecuada de protección civil contribuye a disminuir los daños causados por desastres naturales, así como a reducir al máximo la pérdida de vidas humanas. Es por ello que les pedimos que, en caso de una emergencia, fenómeno natural o situación de riesgo, conserven la calma y desalojen el auditorio de manera ordenada, para concentrarnos en los puntos de seguridad que están ubicados fuera de este edificio. Por su atención, muchas gracias. Para iniciar me permito presentar a la doctora Katrin Hahn-Laudenberg, quien nos ofrecerá la conferencia magistral Características de la Educación para, sobre y a través de la democracia en la escuela. Para participar con sus preguntas, les solicitamos que utilicen el código QR que se encuentra en la parte posterior de su gafete. Muchas gracias. La doctora Katrin Hahn-Laudenberg es profesora de Educación Cívica y Ciencias Sociales en la Universidad de Münster. Su investigación se centra en estudios comparativos internacionales sobre educación cívica y ciudadana, con especial interés en cómo las experiencias educativas y participativas en el entorno escolar influyen en el conocimiento político y en la formación de actitudes. Asimismo, trabaja en la profesionalización de futuros docentes en el ámbito de las ciencias sociales, especialmente en el diseño de clases discursivas y en el abordaje pedagógico de temas sociales y políticos controvertidos. Su labor integra la reflexión sobre la enseñanza de las ciencias sociales como eje para fortalecer la educación cívica y ciudadana en todas las asignaturas, así como en los procesos de desarrollo y mejora escolar. Actualmente se desempeña como Coordinadora Nacional de Investigación y dirige el Centro de Estudios Alemán para el International Civic and Citizenship Education Study, ICCS, 2027 en Münster. A nivel internacional, preside el Comité de Desarrollo del Marco y de las Pruebas del ICCS 2027, colaborando en la construcción del marco conceptual y de los instrumentos del estudio. Cedemos la palabra a la doctora Hahn-Laudenberg con este aplauso.
Is it better now? Okay, so shall I start again? Okay. So it's a pleasure for me to open the second day of this conference. And in my presentation, I will discuss perspective on education for democracy, and I will introduce civic topic, controversy, participation, and recognition in the classroom as four fundamental features of education about and through democracy. And for each of these features, I will present empirical insights in results of the ICCS study, which is the largest international assessment of civic and citizenship education. So I will structure my presentation into two main parts. And first, we will examine the theoretical perspectives on education for democracy in times of democratic backlash. Second, I will shortly introduce the International Civic and Citizenship Education Study. And in the third part, we will delve into the four core features of education about and through democracy. And doing this, I hope to show you how the different features are interlinked if we aim on education for democracy. So all over the world, democracy is under threat. If we look at current political developments, we can see a rise in authoritarian populism and increased polarization in all areas of the world. At the same time, more and more people wonder whether democratic systems are capable of solving global crises such as climate change. The persistence of democracy, we can conclude, is no longer can be taken for granted. In response to this and to these multiple threats, this multiple crises, sorry, I heard this translation. More and more raise the voice and say, okay, we need more education for democracy, and this can be a solution for the current democratic crisis. For example, in Germany, the AfD, right extremist party, now is becoming more and more popular. In the election we will have in this year in some federal states, it may become the strongest party. And on all levels now, education for democracy is strengthened, and all civil and political agents, which are not the right-wing ones, try to preserve, try to strengthen democracy through education, through democracy. And at the same time, the AfD, the right-wing party, try to unsettle and intimidate educators that openly takes a stance against this populist and racist movement. And at a first glance, all this, we can say, invocations on education for democracy share a common goal, the persistence of democracy. However, there are different ways of understanding how education should fulfill this task. One way focused on protecting the existing democratic system as it is. Here, education meant to stabilize democracy, defend and preserve the democratic system in the current state. Following in another way, others argued that democracy can only persist if we change, if we transform. From this perspective, education has the task to preserve democracy, but in a way to realize the more accomplished democracy and contributing to its transformation. However, both kinds of ideas, both ideas that education is a solution to democratic crisis, can be criticized in two perspectives. First, it's a political risk. If education is framed as a main solution, politics and society might shift responsibility to the schools. This could function as an excuse not to address structural causes and characteristics of democratic threats, as inequality, issues related to infrastructure or sustainability, or the strategies of anti-democratic actors. And second, it's a pedagogical risk. If education for democracy is reduced to the goal of stabilizing the system, students are treated as an instrument to secure the future of the democracy. They become the object of education, and they are not valued in themselves. In this view, the individual formation of the student becomes secondary to the survival of the system. Such an understanding of education for democracy carries the risk of switching into indoctrination, which betrays the very idea of democracy. Oh, sorry. So I think that's where we have to be. Yeah. So education in a democracy therefore has to take the student seriously as a subject of education. If we do so, maturity, Mündigkeit, as we say in German, or maybe we can say civic formation, is a unifying goal to where the students are in the center, and it's about that they are able to be responsible for their own life and decide how they want to shape and contribute to democracy. And at the same time, we have the same tension or a similar tension as before. So if we think of students as subjects, we can still think about, is it more important that the students adapt to the common values, or is it more important that they emancipate, that they reflect, that they critical stand back and look on society and what has to be changed? And in whole, it becomes clear education for democracy is located in a field of tension, and we can see the tension between adaptation, stability, emancipation and change, and the tension between looking on the students as a subject and looking on the political system, the democratic system. But at the same time, these opposing sides are also dependent on another. Democracy, as I pointed out before, needs democratic citizens in order to persist. But at the same time, democracy provides the freedom and the opportunity for individuals, for citizens, to develop democratic maturity and to develop freedom and to develop their own way of living, to shape the system, to shape the common life. And at the same time, commitment to democratic values is essential, because on this base, we can change and introduce changes in a way that strengthens and not weakens the persistence of democracy. So this double field of tension offers us an important framework for reflection. However, it does not told us how to implement education for democracy specifically in schools. Following Becerra, a current approach of education for democracy has to be think together with education about and through democracy, the content and the practices at schools. And so in the second part of my talk, I will therefore shift the focus from the goals to the processes on the school level. How can we implement education about democracy and through democracy in everyday school life? Doing this, I will refer to the results of the International Civic and Citizenship Education Study. ICCS is the largest international and only dedicated study of civic and citizenship education, and it involves a representative sample of 8th grade students and their teachers. And in ICCS 2022, and then I will mainly refer to this study, that's the last cycle we have results from. 2020 countries participate in 2 federal states from Germany, and if I speak about Germany in the later time, it's always North Rhine-Westphalia, so one federal state, the federal state with the largest population in Germany. And by comparing these diverse educational systems, we gain a unique insight in how different political and social contexts, but also how different ways of shaping schools and shaping civic and citizenship education at schools can influence the civic knowledge, attitudes, and engagement of 14-year-olds. This afternoon, Maria Magdalena Isaac, who's sitting here in front, will really provide a very comprehensive overview of the ICCS framework, and therefore I will keep this very, very brief and simply situate my reflections in this assessment framework. And in particular, I will focus on processes within the malleable context of schooling, and that is those aspects of civic and citizenship education that school can shape, that school can organize and realize. So I want to go beyond Becerra's 3 dimensions, and therefore I suggest a framework that specifies education about and through democracy with further with 4 features. With including the civic content, this is really something which is education about democracy, is I think the first thing we think about if you think about teaching about democracy is contents we could relate to the political or the civic. On the other hand, participation and recognition specify practices of education through democracy, so it's really the experiences students make in school. Controversy combines both dimensions. it's teaching about controversies is crucial to understand democracy, so it's education about democracy. But teaching in a way that practice controversy at school is an experience of democratic practice. Each of these 4 features can be realized, I would propose, in the different spaces of school. So, and of course, there are some spaces that are more narrow to one feature, but I would argue that all different features can be realized in all different areas or places. So we can say that civic content, of course, is most likely taking place in the core subjects of civic and citizenship education, but I will show that also in all subjects it can be discussed, and similar, this is true for controversy. And we might argue that participation seems to be easier to implement outside the traditional lessons constructs, but of course also participation can take place within lessons. And recognition finally is relevant in all areas of school life, but it may be most visible in the overall school culture, but of course it should be also realized in the everyday interaction in the schools. So let's look at the first feature, civic content. Here content is not, I don't think of content as static facts about politics. So instead we may view the curriculum through a lens that reveals the political and the civic relevance in any subject matters. And this can be detected in different ways. First, we can look at how subjects relate to the social relatedness of persons at the local, national or global level. Second, we can look at collective perceptions of social problems, of power structures, of conflicts. And third, we can look at how collective decision-making takes place and how these different perspectives on how we live together are negotiated and how they, in society, they agreed to come to binding rules. And to emphasize civic content in a whole school task, let's look at how civic content appears or can appear in diverse subject areas. For example, in music and art, we can explore creative expressions as a tool for empowerment. And for example, in language arts, we can train debating, or we can look at the political themes in poems, in novels, and in dramas. And in the STEM fields, I think it's quite obvious that we can investigate the social impact of technology, AI, energy, and the political dimension, for example, of climate change. And this integration enables students to detect the civic in every facet of their world. But does civic content affect our students? Does it bother them? So in the ICCS data, we asked the students what is in their view how huge specific topics are threats for the future of the Earth. And the data clearly shows that students bother. We have here the average of students in different regions. The first is the pink one is the average of Europe. The next is Germany, and then Spain, Brazil, and Colombia. And you see it for different topics. The percentage of students to view this as a large threat. And we see that, for example, environmental pollution and climate change in nearly all countries, 70 till 80% say this is a huge threat for future. So it's really a unifying perspective of this is a huge challenge. And also further questions of, for example, security and social justice affect young people. And here we can detect more country-specific patterns that reflect the different realities the students live in. So if students are concerned about the world, do they have the space to voice those concerns in school? We can see here a result for one single item in the context of open classroom climate, and I'm sorry, it's now a different order. We see the regions or educational systems here, and we see the answer options in green. They say that happens often, blue sometimes, violet rarely, and red never. And we asked the students, how often does it happen if social and political issues are discussed or are negotiated at class, that students bring up current political events for discussion. And we see here that ICCS shows us that educational systems differed very strongly in the extent that students report that this happened. And German didactics has a very traditional, strong emphasis on relating learning about democracy with current political topics, and we can see this here. Germany with Poland was one of the highest percentages, and we see that 1/3 say this happened often, another nearly 40% this happens sometimes. At the same time, we have a discussion to what extent teachers really succeed in using these current issues for the development of conceptual understanding of politics. So that leads us to the second feature, which is closely related to revealing the civic, the political relevance of educational content, and this is controversy. Introducing controversy in class is important for many reasons. Firstly, it's a mirror of the political discourse in democracies. So I understand democracies differ from authoritarian systems in that different opinions, that conflicts are not suppressed, but can be negotiated openly. So bringing the discourse, the controversy into class is showing how democracies are. Second, it's a very effective way of promoting political judgment and argumentation skills. We saw, and it's a way of making things open the emotional perspective of the political. We remember the very inspiring talk yesterday afternoon, how strong the impact of emotion can be, how strong the power of emotion can be for learning. And controversy is something that is emotional and has the potential to foster learning. And therefore we can say it's a fundamental principle of civic education, and but at the same time, it's a particular challenge in polarized times. So in polarized times, we see that teachers shy away to discuss controversial issues, and it's a contested concept. So for example, in Germany, we currently have a lot of discussion about which topics shall we discuss controversial and which topics shall we not discuss controversial. And at some points we agree, so we won't treat equally the denial of human-made climate change with other positions. We won't treat racist statements as other statements, but the border is blurry, and so this is really a very hot discussion, for example, in Germany. In the German discourse, the discussion about controversy based on the Beutelsbach Consensus, which is an official agreement from the 1970s, but now is taking up a lot of guidelines and curricula. And more and more it's also discussed in international contexts. It consists of 3 principles. So first, it says that teachers must not overwhelming students with their own political view or hinder students to make an independent political judgment. And that's the principle of non-indoctrination. So second, it says that issues that are controversial in politics or in science should be, in an epistemically perspective, should also be presented as controversial in class. And third, I think that's a very important point as well, students need to be given the opportunity to analyze their own political interests and learn how to influence a given political situation based on this analysis. It's important to note that the Beutelsbacher Consensus does not establish a requirement of neutrality towards anti-democratic or anti-human statements. And also in Germany, teachers are allowed to articulate their own political position in the classroom as long as they do not overhelp students, but say this is one option of the position and it's completely okay to have another one. But to introduce controversy, to inspire in discussion, it's an option. In ICCF, we have a scale, the Open Classroom Climate Scale, which is widely used for analyzing and which capture and tackle aspects of controversy and non-indoctrination. And we already looked at item C. So this is an item student brings up current political events. So we already looked at that in the content section. And now I want to look at another item. The item B, which addressed controversy in a very broad sense, teacher encouraged students to express their opinions. And you see the same kind of figure as we saw before. So the greens are the percentages of students in the different educational systems that say that happen often, blue sometimes, violet rarely, and red never. And we see here that results show a slightly different picture than the one about students bringing current political issues into class. So here, for example, students in Germany report less open than the European average, that the students feel encouraged to express their opinions, while particularly in Colombia, but also in Spain and Brazil, students report this more often than in the European average. So let me now turn to participation as a core feature of education through democracy. When I speak of participation, I do not mean the mere attendance in educational processes, nor I do mean simply fulfilling the student role, like, for example, raising hands, answering questions, doing the tasks that they have to do. In the context of democratic education at school, participation refers to actions that aimed at influencing or shaping school-related processes and decisions on different levels, in the class, on the school level, and maybe even in the relation of the school to the community. Participation in this sense means having a real opportunity to contribute and help shape a shared practice and structures of learning. So where can we experience participation at school? It can be experienced in the classroom and in projects, for example, with self-determined cooperative and action-orientating learning designs, but of course maybe even more if we decide collaboratively about the selection of content, teaching methods or materials, or even discussing how forms of assessment can be used and maybe how formative assessment can enhance learning. In my opinion, it's particularly important to add a third aspect here. In my view, it's important to reflect in the classroom about students' experiences about participation at school, but also about the limits of participation at school. Because, of course, schools are a hierarchical system, and they have many goals. Even the teachers are not free to decide what to do. So there's a curriculum. There are specific rules they cannot overcome. And to reflect this and to be transparent and not neglect the hierarchy that exists in schools, I think this is very important for participation at schools as well. And at the same time, and maybe even more, participation can take place in school life in general. And maybe we think first about institutionalized rights and processes of co-decision and active participation in school governments. And these are very important forms, and normally these are the forms where the impact of students can be can be strongest. So, for example, in Germany, in some federal states, we have very strong opportunities to decide on the school government. In other federal states, they are only consulting rights. Sometimes it's really co-decision, sometimes it's consulting. It's very different between different federal states in Germany. I think less attention gets a second area of participation, and I think it's a very important to give spaces for agency that students themselves can take. So they want to do something, they take a room, they build a group to shape school environment, to bring up new ideas, and to represent their collective interests. These both types of participation, we know from different research, are taken more often or more likely by students who are privileged in different ways, who have experienced participation out of school, who feel that they can take the stand, they have an internal efficacy, the self-confidence of doing so. So if we want participation to be realized by more students and more equally realized, we have to provide guided forms of participation so that students get more self-confident in taking responsibility for their own actions. So the third form of participation in school life, which is more problem-orientated, more low-level, maybe more guided, to foster in the next step more self-guided forms of participation is very important too. So how does it look at school? We again look at the ICCS data, and now you already know the figure. The first is again the European average, and then the a selection of different countries. And we asked 8th grade students about their experience of participation during the past year, and it's 8th grade students, so they are 14 years old. And then as a general pattern, we see that very basic institutionalized forms of participation, such as voting for student councils or for class representatives, are reported more frequently. And project-based and discourse-orientated forms are less common. So if you look at this more closely, we can see different country-specific patterns. For example, Germany, as an example, shows a very strong focus on institutionalized forms. 2/3 report they elect the class representatives. We have to take into account it's compulsory in Germany to vote for the class representatives in all schools. So we might think about why 1/3 at least cannot remember to vote for class representatives. Might be not that important in the practice in all schools, but in theory there is a rule that school have to provide this kind of participation. And at the same time, if we look at the second, this is participation in activities to make the school more environment-friendly. So it's a problem-oriented form, and we see here that North Rhine-Westphalia has only 11% report this. It's one of the least reported percentages in the whole ICCS study. So we see it's really a focus on institutionalized forms, and the other forms are very rarely realized. And we have other countries, for example, Spain and Colombia report comparably high levels of both institutionalized and more active forms of participation. And we have other countries that have less focus on institutionalized forms, and more the focus is more on the more problem-orientated forms of participation. However, if participatory experiences are to be meaningful, are meant to be meaningful, they must be grounded in recognition. So creating participation spaces without recognizing the right of students to have a voice will turn formal participation rights into tokenism. And therefore I would look in a second slide. I will now merge two different items. So we also asked in ICCS the perception of students about the value of participation at school. So here, now on the left, it's the same you saw before, the amount of students who reported they elected students in the last year, class representative, for example. And on the right side, we have the perception if voting in students' election makes a difference to what happens at my school. And we see here that it's not the same in all countries. There are some countries with a very high level of participation, reported participation, but a lower level of students saying, this really makes a difference. And the other way around. So in other words, the institutional structures of participation are important. I don't want to say they are not important. I think they are very important. But they alone do not guarantee a really meaningful participation, and they do not ensure recognition. And that leads me to the last, but not least, feature of education through democracy. And this is recognition. A theoretical foundation of this perspective on recognition can be found in Alex Honnold's concepts of the struggle of recognition, and he differs 3 modes of recognition, or he say there's 3 modes. This is love, respect, and solidarity, and these modes of recognition really are the baseline of society, of living together. And the struggle, that's the name of the book, the struggle for recognition can explain a lot of social conflicts and the way social society works. And so these are not merely normative ideas, but they can be understood as institutionalized, mediated structures that shape on the one hand the social coexistence and the individual life trajectory. Because you see, if Honnold argued that if these modes of recognition are violated, this will affect our self-relation. So it will affect our self-confidence, our self-respect, or our self-esteem. And he also say that to a smaller extent we can, if we are violated in one type and we are strong settled in another type of recognition, that can somehow help us to overcome the harm this is done. So if I really have a close contact with my family and I have a lot of effective recognition, then I might cope better, for example, with insults or degradation at work. I can cope with this better. That is his general idea, so they are not completely independent. So, and if we now look at the corresponding forms of misrecognition, I think it becomes clear if we think maybe in our own experiences or in reports and books we read about schooling, that compulsory schooling, as important it is for something as social equality, qualification, at the same time it's a high risk of denying recognition of students. Because of the hierarchy, because of you are forced to go there, even if you're feared. If students are feared to go to school because they are feared of students or feared of teachers, they have to go. They cannot decide not to go. So Graham and others thought about how to transfer this idea of recognition to schools, and they say we cannot really take the same to the school because we have a hierarchical system as a professional relationship between teachers and students. So for example, we would not speak of love in this context. And so they come out with 3 types of recognition at school. And this is the first is caring. So the unconditional concern for the well-being and needs of an actual person, no matter how the person is, how his or her grades are, how he or he behave. We still have to care for the people and have to care for their well-being. The second is the level of respect, so the recognition of the moral accountability of a person and the right of having a voice. It's not the idea that students and teachers have the same rights or that it's not a denying of hierarchy, but to accept that students have rights, that they have a voice, that they have their own, they are accountable for what they are doing. That is meant here by the level of respect, and we see here the close connection to participation. And the third is valuing, acknowledging, encouraging, and supporting students in their differences, also in relation to their contributions, to their abilities and their skills. And Graham and others show in their research very impressively how recognition works as a mediator between participation and experiences and well-being at school. So if we relate the wording to items we have in ICCS, we can look at the student-teacher relationships, and we see that here the three types of recognition I introduced to you, we can find all the three dimensions covered in the scale. So we see the aspects of value, of care, and of respect. And here I want to again look at the empirical results we have in ICCS 2022, and I know it's quite a complex figure, but I will lead you through it. Here I took a time perspective, and I look in an international comparison how student-teacher relations on a scale level change over time. So the red dots are the average scores in 2022, the blue dots in 2016, and the green dots in 2009, and I selected countries that participate in all three cycles. And we can see here in general that students report in the minority, that the relationships between students and teachers are positive, because the average are in the light blue area, and this is a positive. That means that the minority say it's positive, but of course not all students. And between the 2009 and 2016 cycle, student-teacher relation improved in most countries. They are very strong, for example, in Taiwan. However, in 2022, students report feeling less recognized compared to 2016. And this is particularly true for the European countries. This may be related to the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic and the disruption that continued to affect schools in 2022. And for this reason, the data in 2027 will be particularly interesting, because they will show if this is only a temporary decline or a long-term development that really it's the teacher-student relation is getting worse. And the more detailed analysis we do with the German data also show that the minority of students that feel less recognized are more likely to belong to groups that have risk of marginalization in other fields and other aspects, so less social economically privileged, students with migration background, for example. And intersections of this. For example, in Germany, male students with migration backgrounds are students that have huge problems of recognition at school, and yes. So in any case, this finding underlines that recognition in schools require our continuous attention and our pedagogical strategies, because we see cannot be taken for granted. Developments can change directions, and recognition is not the same for all students. So we have social injustice here. So this is the last empirical model I will show you. I would like to illustrate how connecting features of education about, through, and for democracy can deepen our understanding and can deepen analysis of civic and citizenship education. And this model examines how school experiences and learning processes relate to students' satisfaction with the political system. This is here, so we ask students if they are satisfied how the political system works and how elected political actors contribute to the interest of the citizens. And on this side, we can see here in the blue color, we can see aspects of education through democracy, and we see that student-student relation and student-teacher relationships contribute to a more higher satisfaction of the political system, and to a lesser extent the experience participation through value of participation was less strong. At the same time, in open classroom climate, we can see here, contribute to higher civic knowledge, and this is associated with a more critical view on how the political system performs. And this path is made from North Rhine-Westphalia, but we see a similar pattern in all countries, but here the patterns differed. Here, in most countries where the perceived corruption is higher, the connection is stronger negative, so students with higher knowledge get even more critical, while in countries with very, very few perceived corruption, for example, I think Norway, it's not significant, so we don't have a negative correlation. So we see here that school can influence in very different ways students' attitudes. And as I discussed at the beginning, it's not that we want that education makes students more satisfied with the political system, no matter how the system works. But we want students to have a more reflective, a more reasoned position here. And we see this can work particularly to open classroom climate and to fostering civic knowledge, but of course recognition is important as well. So conclude, I think our analysis underscore that all four features are vital for comprehensive civic formation. And however, I want to point out the finding that addressing controversy with an open classroom climate is particularly essential element for developing a reflective and critical citizenship. And because it's through the encounter of conflicting ideas of multi-perspectivity within a safe and recognized space that students learn to navigate the complexities of modern society. And with this, thank you for your kind attention, and I'm really looking forward for the discussion. And if you speak in Spanish, there will be a translation, so I will understand you.
Muchísimas gracias. Agradecemos infinitamente a la doctora Katrin Hahn-Laudenberg por su notable participación en la conferencia magistral Características de la educación para, sobre y a través de la democracia en la escuela. Hemos integrado en una sola pregunta, dos preguntas que nos hicieron del auditorio. No sé si está escuchando la doctora en inglés. ¿Sí? Yes. Perfecto. Perfecto. Ok, la pregunta es: ¿cuál es la mejor manera para discutir sobre diferentes perspectivas con un enfoque no violento en una sociedad donde un partido controla a la mayoría de la mentalidad de la sociedad o donde un gobierno no democrático controla el sistema educativo?
Can you repeat the question in the translation? Okay. So I think the question is how much freedom we have at school. So how and then in a school it can be a lot of things can be realized. For example, I will show the example of Poland. Poland in 2022 was at the border of being less democratic, less open. There was a lot of pressure of civic education on educators within schools, but also outside schools. And when we looked at the results on ICCS in an international comparison, I was like, oh, we have a mistake in Poland. It must be something wrong, because students report to discuss current political issues. They report that the discussion is controversial, and the teachers report that as well. And then there was the election in Poland, and the government changed. Even if before there was a lot of pressure on civic education, a lot of pressure on the media, on the social media, it was still there were still the elections, and we had this peaceful change in government, but it was pressure, and teachers stand up, and obviously we see it in the results. Teachers discussed with students these topics and allow them to take a stand. And so I think that here education really contributes to the persistence of democracy shaped that way. And so I think to look for spaces of freedom, even in contexts that are restricting, I think this is a very important job for teachers. I'm not sure if I answer your question, I hope.
Sí, muy bien, muy claro, muchísimas gracias. Nuestra siguiente pregunta es, usted presentó la controversia como un principio fundamental de la educación cívica y ciudadana. ¿Cuál sería una estrategia integral para implementar o fomentar la controversia en la escuela?
Yes, I think I think it is important to look at in two different ways, at least two different ways. I think the first is looking at the curricula and finding where are the civic content, where are the controversial topics in the different subjects, and how can we make them visible, and to include this in the curriculum, because we all know schools have to stick to the curriculum, and teachers, and then it will be in the textbooks, and then teachers are more easily to take this up. But the other thing, and I think it's even more important to train teachers, to professionalize teachers to do this. We asked I could not show this because there was no time to show it, but we asked teachers how they deal with controversial issues as a national edition. And we see that in this research and in other research that teachers, particularly if they are not they are not trained in civic and citizenship education, that they more likely shy away not to raise a controversial issue, because it's a risk, of course. You do not know, you do not know how the students will react, maybe you don't feel confident in the content, you do not know if you can take a stand or not, where are the borders, what are the methods. So I think teacher professionalization is very important, and for future teachers, but also for teachers who already worked in school. So I think this is really a crucial point to give them. It's not to say this is the right way of doing it, but to give them, for example, I'm working in teacher education, and we look on videos or in comics, and we discuss how would you react in that situation, and how could you do this, and this gives the teachers and the future teachers confidence to really implement it at school.
Muchísimas gracias, doctora, muy interesante. Y pues agradecemos nuevamente e infinitamente a la doctora Katrin Hahn-Laudenberg, a quien se le dará entrega de un merecido reconocimiento por su participación en esta conferencia magistral. Invitamos a los participantes a las ponencias simultáneas que comenzarán a las 10:15 horas, por lo que se les invita también a consultar la guía del Congreso a través del código QR que está en la parte posterior de su gafete. Muy buen día y que disfruten el Congreso.
You'll get yours later.